Media Studies, and I'm based here at UCT Center in ICT4D. Saying that I'm a Media Studies PhD candidate might be a little bit misleading. I kind of like to view myself as sort of this hybrid progeny of Media Studies meets Visual Communications in ICT4D research. There's I was quite conflicted as to what I wanted to come and tell you guys about today, which is a sort of process where I put up a title on the program which isn't what I'm going to be talking about today, which I find is sort of this very normal state for PhD students to be in, where we spend an entire year sort of researching and reading things and downloading articles off of the internet, only to find that we're constantly reevaluating where the direction that we're going in. And at the end of a long year, I feel comfortable with having achieved one thing. And I'm not even entirely sure if I've achieved it yet, but I would like to share with you guys my sort of journey in uncovering my research question. So about 2 weeks ago, I defended my proposal, which was entitled Creative Participation and Mobile Ecologies Among Aspiring Visual Designers in 2 Bridging Course Settings in Cape Town. Now, in a nutshell, I propose to take an action research approach in uncovering sort of creative participation and mobile, especially pertaining to visual ecologies, among aspiring visual designers from particularly low-income and resource-constrained backgrounds who are sort of taking part in bridging courses in Cape Town, with a sort of a focus on formal design education, and then also with the aim of developing a mobile application for Nokia phones. Now, to give you guys a bit of background on this particular intersection of research and my own resonance with the topic, I would have to divulge that I myself am a graphic designer and illustrator. I studied at Stellenbosch University. I obtained my bachelor's degree and my honors, after which I worked in advertising for 2 years in London and in Johannesburg, and then sort of returned to academia to pursue my master's in media studies. Now, my exodus from the advertising world was largely ethically motivated. I felt like I was sort of dragged into this vortex of manufacturing false desires and exploiting teenage vanity and insecurity to push products. Most sort of horrifying of all to me was this sort of notion that those who had very little money-wise were somehow inferior, worth less, and I had to look up to those who had lots of cash to burn. And one of the interesting things about this sort of tension is how it comes into play in sort of local, low-income arenas. And this was something that was the topic of my master's dissertation. I had a look at sort of discourses surrounding video games and identities, stereotypes, gender roles, and socio-technical ecologies among young kids from a previously sort of colored township in Ocean View. And I started uncovering really interesting narratives surrounding this sort of intersection of sort of video games being introduced to this very resource-constrained setting. And although this research was quite fascinating to me, and I really enjoyed it, I kind of missed having visual design and visual sort of communications as a central focus in the kind of work that I was doing. And I made this sort of my personal journey or quest to uncover somehow a topic where I could bridge all of these interest groups of myself. One of the takeaways from this sort of research that I did was the central role of the mobile phone in these kinds of communities, which is something that I suppose you guys have all discussed in length at this sort of gathering, seeing as it's ICT4D in South Africa. So that was also something that I really wanted to focus on. Concurrently, I'm sure most of you should know that Cape Town was also awarded World Design Capital for 2014, which makes this sort of a very interesting time to start looking at discourses surrounding design, especially in terms of design for betterment as some kind of silver bullet for socioeconomic change. We have sort of Design Indaba proclaiming a better world through design. And this accolade sat a bit uneasy with me in relation to the kind of work that I was doing during my master's. Because although we can all agree Cape Town is a city that's beautiful, aesthetically beautiful, it is also a city that was designed with sort of the purposes of racial segregation in mind. And these sorts of inequalities in the city are still proliferated and perpetuated today. I had this really strong interest in what was actually going on in design industry in Cape Town. And this is where I started, sort of getting in my car and driving to places and going to talk to people. And what I found, I visited tertiary educational sort of design institutions. I visited sort of people who were organizing World Design Capital, some of the larger government bodies. And what I found was an industry that was primarily sourced from the middle classes. Maybe not surprisingly, with the kind of sort of unequal access to spaces and places in Cape Town. And so I kind of naively asked myself, why is there this participation gap in those who actually have access to design education, careers, resources, and those who don't? And I sort of went back to a lot of the kids that I was hanging out with during my master's research, as well as sort of research that I was assisting on, and I kind of have all of these contacts that are now sort of in their late teens, early 20s. And I went to go chat with them and I asked them, why aren't kids doing anything in sort of media? Why is no one pursuing media careers? And they said, even though there's quite a bit of sort of social capital in these kind of careers, and people are really interested in following careers in design, and there's a lot of sort of natural artistic talent, they just have no examples of people having ever gained access to these sorts of courses. So I went back to the tertiary institutions, drove all the way, had a few months sort of asking questions around that side. And what I found from sort of heads of departments was that even though kids were applying for these kind of courses, they didn't have the necessary visual and computer literacies to slot in at a first year basis. Now, as we all know, sort of visual literacy and computer literacy aren't exactly things that are cultivated among low-income township youth. And just to give you a sense of some of the sort of the numbers, and this is from an official government document and from Equal Education, a website that really starts looking into sort of these unequal access to resources. Only about 26% of high schools in the Greater Cape Town have art up until a school leaving level. Furthermore, slightly, incrementally over 10% of the public ordinary schools in South Africa have any kind of computer lab. So these are sort of just I suppose the formal kind of sections, but it gives us an indication of the kind of access that people have to these sort of literacies and cultivating these kinds of literacies. At the same time, so after finding out about this on the sort of secondary level, I returned to sort of fishing around what kids were doing in the high schools. And I had a number of these high schools that I visited, and I had a look at what kind of graphic design and art syllabus was being offered. And one of the sort of the standout stories to me, which became quite a metaphor and an anecdote for this sort of unequal design and art education, was that there's a centre in Newlands called the Frankie Baer Centre. And what they do is they offer extra art subjects to kids from local high schools. But they also have this brilliant initiative called Ibabatane, which basically what they do is they try and support the arts and culture curriculum of kids in sort of low-income township schools. And initially it started up as like a teacher training program, so they would have teachers coming in and teach them about sort of arts and culture curriculum, and what they eventually found worked better is to get the kids in with the teachers. So the time that I spent at the centre, you would see in the mornings and the afternoons these buses coming in with hundreds of kids every day to come and do arts and culture lessons at Frankie Baer. Now this seems like quite a big impact project if you put it that way, hundreds of kids coming every day getting arts education. But if you think in sort of the bigger picture, that each individual school only actually ever visits the centre about once a month to once every month and a half, you start seeing how very sort of thinly spread the specialist education is. At this point, the bottom line started sinking in, and I was like, well, in light of World Design Capital, and in light of the 20th anniversary of our democracy, it is quite apparent that access to design education and resources are highly unequal and undemocratic. But at the same time, and as I mentioned before, I had this really big interest in sort of mobile ecologies. And I just want to read to you guys some recent numbers in terms of internet access in South Africa. So a 2012 study by Delannoy started looking at how people were accessing the internet and how they were living their sort of screen lives, if you will. Roundabout, how much time?
Maybe
all the time.
3 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to skip over this. You guys all know, Cape Town, South Africa, mobile-centric society. Okay, so I started looking at informal uses for sort of visual communications, which there's a lot of literature that I'm quite a big fan of that supposes that sort of fun and entertainment use can actually breed a familiarity with technologies which then might be later used for sort of more instrumental, serious uses. And some young people are able to leverage these sorts of skill sets into tertiary careers and turn their interests into sort of careers. Oh geez, do I really only have 2 minutes left? I've got so much more left to say.
Like 5 minutes.
Okay.
It's a Q&A time. See?
Am I okay? Can I go? Okay. Let me actually take that back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, right now we're living in this time of prolific visual communication. And a lot of these sort of apps support these kinds of articulations and expressions that are enabled by camera phones and sort of smartphones in particular. And like I said, some young people are able to leverage these skills into tertiary education and then turn their interests into careers. But many other who don't necessarily have access are also negotiating and appropriating the resources that are available to them in pursuit of creative participation. So I sort of, at this stage, and sorry if it's very anecdotal, and please don't call me out on any scientific methods, because this is just coming up with a research question. So I went back and sort of started looking at how people were addressing this deficit, or identified deficit, in sort of helping kids into graphic design courses. And I found two really, I only found two, but I'm sure there must be more, sort of establishments and institutions that use a bridging course metaphor to acquaint young people with the necessary visual and computer literacies to go on and slot into first year studies. And one of these is at CPUT, the Foundations in Graphic Design course, which sort of is quite, there's a lot of sort of these kind of kids sitting in those courses I found. And then there's one in Khayelitsha at Learn to Earn, graphic design bridging course. But then at the same time, what I sort of also found in these kind of courses when talking to kids was that there was this really prolific visual communication already going on their mobile phones. And kids were kind of like going through immense difficulties to make cool images on these sorts of mobile online sort of applications and things that they could access at very high data costs. And these are sorts of the kind of articulations and things that we were seeing, which as someone who's a media studies scholar also is quite interesting, because you're seeing sort of movements from sort of cultural articulations that move from sort of embodied to visual sort of manifestations. At the same time, it's also useful to mention that sort of big visual design giants such as Adobe are already redeveloping their software for a mobile and especially sort of a tablet-based ecology, which might indicate a sort of a democratization of design on smaller screens for smaller screens, a lighter mode of design that might bring more people into the conversation. So at the end of all of this, at this end of this long journey, these are the kind of research questions that I've come up with. Firstly, what are the practical and technical skills that are considered necessary among institutional gatekeepers for students' acceptance into these design courses? So we're looking at sort of the kind of competences and forms of cultural capital that are used as gatekeepers, what discourses are used to describe participant shortcomings, what prior knowledge do participants have that gatekeepers do not recognize, and what strategies and discoveries do participants use to gain access to these courses. Secondly, what is the media ecology among students, and specifically the ecology supporting visual media production? And then lastly, given these requirements and ecologies, what functionalities should the mobile visual design app provide? What interface strategies could assist in overcoming the constraints and sort of limited screen space and processing power? So just, I mean, this is the kind of thing that I wanted to come and share with you guys, because I feel that it was something that was very helpful for me as a postgraduate student, hearing how other people came up with their research questions and the kind of immense journey that not a lot of us ever really get to talk about once we do these sorts of presentations. And a bunch of the lessons that I've sort of learned through this year and this process. Firstly, I would highly recommend reading as much as you can, not only academic text, but keep a finger on the pulse of what's actually going on in the sort of the media industry and popular media, publications, blogs, etc. Secondly, go visit actual people. Once you feel you get stuck, get in your car and go visit people. Yeah, just get out, run around, talk to some people. And then, yeah, sort of lastly, don't always think that that's all your life has to be about. Some of my most breakthrough moments have been hanging out with friends and having a glass of wine. Just constantly remain aware of your kind of research questions and go about and live your life, and you'll start seeing things kind of fall together in the way that they should.